Just because you get comfortable and because you have things to look after doesn't mean you should not also pursue the best version of yourself. And if the best version of yourself means that you need to relocate, start a new company or whatever, or get a job, whatever it is, why not do it? Hopefully we can always reinvent ourselves, no matter the age and the responsibilities we have.
Welcome to Brave. Learn from Southeast Asia's best tech leaders. Build the future, learn from our past, and stay human in between. No BS on success. I'm Jeremy Au, venture capitalist, Sierra founder, Harvard MBA, science fiction nerd, and dad of 2 daughters. Every week, we debate startup news, interview changemakers, answer listener questions, and share personal insights. Join our movement of over 40,000 members and get transcripts, resources, and community at www.bravesea.com. Stay well and stay brave. Hey, Victor. Really excited to have you on the show. I think it's been about 1 year since I last invited you for this thing. And so I'm really excited to have you to share your story because I think you're such a human writer and such a human person that I really enjoyed our conversations. And I think you have some really important experiences for the founders of Southeast Asia to hear. Before we get further, could you share a little bit about yourself?
Sure. First of all, thank you very much for having me. Really appreciate the opportunity to share a bit about what I've been through so far. So for people who don't know me, originally I'm from Bulgaria, born and raised there. When I was 18, I moved to Denmark for studies. So I spent about 7 years in Denmark. And at that time, it was pretty difficult decision because my family was like, they said that they can't really support me financially, so I need to figure out on my own. And it took a while for me to really figure out a way to become independent. But I think it was most probably the best decision in my life because it really pushed me out there. I met people from all over the world. And I don't know, it helped me to meet so many interesting people and kind of discover myself in the process. So I spent 7 years in Denmark. I got my bachelor's, my master's there. After Denmark, actually during my studies, I did an internship in Taiwan. And at that time, I think all my classmates were going in the West. Everyone was going to Western Europe. They were going to the US. And I was the only one that went East. And everyone was asking like, why would you do that? Why would you go to Asia? Asia wasn't obviously hot at the time. At least that was in my circle. But I always felt like it would be interesting. And once I kind of arrived in Taiwan and I spent 7 months, if I'm not mistaken, I kind of fell in love with the region and I saw a lot of opportunities. So I was like, once I'm done with my studies, I'll find a way to come back. So then once I was done with Taiwan, went back to Denmark, continued my master's, completed it. And at that time, I kind of started looking for ways to return to Asia. And at the time, I became part of an accelerator program in Malaysia. I'm not sure if they're still around. It's called Magic. Yeah, so kind of Magic relocated me to Malaysia, spent a few months with them. I think we were part of their second cohort. So we built a lifestyle startup like Sweet Escape before Sweet Escape. So we kind of traveled a lot across the region and onboarded to a marketplace a lot of photographers. And that really gave me the chance to explore the region and I really enjoyed it. After the program was completed, we stayed in Indonesia because Indonesia was our largest market. And I ended up living in Indonesia for 4 years. I met my wife. And
Congratulations, you just got married.
thank you so much. Yeah, so that's very new, just maybe 7-8 months ago. I'm actually about to fly to Indonesia for Chinese New Year. So that's a lot of new experiences and learning so much about the culture. It never ends. So thank you for that. Spent 4 years in Indonesia. At some point while I was there, I got approached to join a startup. And that startup was called Greenhouse. I was the first employee, actually. So I was one of the founding members. My wife was the designer because we started a co-working space. It was a kind of premium co-working space. We got a penthouse location in the city center and she designed the place and that's how we met. So for the longest time, we had kind of a dynamic between us, but I tried to steer away from it because I didn't want to, mess up with the business. But we kind of built a business together. We worked very closely. And at some point, I started getting promoted up to the point that I became a co-founder. So I was with Greenhouse for about 4 years. Unfortunately, around COVID, it got really hard to run a real estate business. So that was really hard for us and we needed to figure out a pivot and we tried a few things, but unfortunately at the end we needed to. I think at that time I met you for the first time and we had a conversation and I remember that you were very empathetic, more than most other people I met. So I was kind of thinking what to do next. And afterwards, I relocated to Singapore and I got a job at Docquity where I currently work as the Chief of Staff. So that's kind of in a nutshell what I've been to in the past decade.
Yeah, and I think what we wanted to focus on is this question that a lot of founders have asked, which is what's it like to run a business? I think that's one. But when it's not going well, how to make a set decisions about whether to keep going, persevere, pivot, or wind down. And then obviously, I think there's not just the professional side, but also the personal side of the story. So I think zooming in here, I think the part of it was that when you started out as an early employee, the first employee, and then you got promoted to co-founder. And when I met you, you were busy fundraising, pushing hard. But I think the key realization that we had within that meeting was that it wasn't looking good.
At that time, I was the last person.
Yeah, and then you were the last person in the business. And so I always remember that for me, it was like, here's this guy who's very good, explaining the business very clearly. And then obviously the business is not doing great. And so I think we had a conversation about what the right path for the business was going to be. So what was that thinking at that point of time? Because obviously you joined a company that you thought was going to do well. And then obviously COVID happened. So how does that journey happen from your perspective?
All startups are very unique and very challenging at all times. Even when things are going well, it's still a highly stressful environment. When you have to let go of your team, in our case, because the pandemic is something that never happened before, or at least not in my lifetime. I didn't experience one in that sense. So when that happened and we started noticing the impact of the business, we needed to make some really quick decisions. And then you need to, because again, it wasn't clear, can you meet people? Can you be in the same room? Can you not? But we're in a real estate business. And I needed to let go of a lot of people because we had a restaurant as part of the place as well. So I think we had maybe 40, 50 people working for us. And I needed to let go of so many people online, even though we run an offline business. And that was hard on many levels. And then trying to figure out what to do next and how to do it. No one really knows what's the right solution. There is no one framework that works. Like people can give you advice, like do try this or try that, or this makes sense. But at the end of the day, only you really understand the complexity of your situation. And it's not clear what you have to do. So it was highly stressful. It was hard to find people who could really understand, empathize, and advise the way I needed, right, at that time. So it wasn't clear what direction to take. And again, I'm a foreigner. I don't really have my support system here. I'm still building my network. So that was very tricky. We tried a bunch of different things. And the first time you try something new, a pivot, you get very excited. Okay, this thing definitely going to work because you do all your research and homework and talk to smart people. Yeah, that sounds like a great idea. And you go into it and nothing happens. Like, okay, that's fine. Let's try another thing. And then you try another thing. And then again and again. And with each iteration, your enthusiasm kind of gets lower because it's very hard to keep that excitement. And not just for you, but also for the remaining team. And that for me was the hardest because you're forced to figure it out. And that means you got to do a lot of different things, but your team starts losing faith in your ability to figure it out. And that's very hard. I think that for me was the hardest. How do you keep on creating excitement where it's clear that things are not working that well? So yeah, that for me was very, very difficult. And of course, the last bits of the journey when I was the last man in the company, and I was like, okay, can I really raise money? Yes, I could, maybe on some really, really bad terms, because I just didn't have any leverage. And I was like, would that make sense? No, wouldn't make sense for me. Wouldn't make sense also for our investors, because it just makes the business very difficult to continue. So I was like, what do I do? Can I grow the business a little bit? Yes, but we raised kind of venture capital. It's hard to that growth rate to justify how much we have raised. So I was like, at some point I was just so burned out that I was like, I have to make a difficult decision. And at that time you're like, okay, well, it is what it is. Now what's next? I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting because zooming in a little bit further is like every founder goes through tough times. I mean, it's like a daily experience, right? Yeah. But I think the interesting part is like, you're supposed to persevere. Every founder story is about a person who pushes in that sense. And then if not, there's always the miraculous pivot that happens. But then you make a decision somewhere along the way to say like, okay, I'm going to wind this down. And so how do you make that decision? Like, is that decision made for you? Is there something you have to come to terms with? How's that process?
I mean, it's very hard. And I think we hear the success stories, so there is a lot of survivorship bias there. We don't hear about most of the stories that I guess were the more realistic scenarios. It's very difficult to make the decision because you absolutely want to make sure that you have given your 200%, not just for the sake of your investors, of course, for them, because they believed in you and they bet on you, but also for your own sake. Like you want to make sure that you have tried everything you can and you're absolutely certain that you don't have other options. So it takes a while to reach that conclusion because you have a lot of reserves of energy that you don't, like when you have a regular job, you don't really tap on. But once you run a company, you understand that actually you can do so much more. So you keep on trying and you keep on experimenting. And it's not obvious that you need to make that decision. At least it wasn't obvious to us. So we had a lot of conversations between the rest of the founders and the investors, like talking about it. And this is what we tried, and that's what we tried, and this is what we learned, and this is where we're going. And at some point, it became a consensus amongst all of us. You know, it makes sense for you to do this. And at that point in time, I also felt like, okay, maybe this makes sense. Because I wouldn't think it's fair for me alone to drive that decision if the rest of the people feel there is still something you can do. Right. But when most of the people agree, okay, it's time. We have done everything we can, and we just simply cannot continue. I think at that time, you're like, okay, fine, it is what it is.
Isn't it scary to do so because otherwise you're seen as a quitter? Especially, I mean, if you're the first person to say it or second person to say it.
Yeah.
I mean...
One thing I realized is that your business in your mind takes so much space, and you think is the biggest and most important thing in the world. And the moment it's gone, no one cares. It's like people forget so fast. Even some relatives supposed to have been next to you throughout this time, they're just like, move on. And I was like, wow, that in my mind was like part of my identity is gonna shatter, and like I'm not good enough. And then you go talk to some people and most people forgot. They just moved on. And it's really interesting to see that. And actually you get surprised when people remember.
Yeah.
Every once in a while, someone's going to come, hey man, how is that business? And I'm like, oh, you remember. So it's interesting, that dynamic. Because I guess what I'm trying to say is much bigger in your mind than what in the collective mind. People just have their own things to look after.
Yeah.
They move on very fast.
And that's obviously with the benefit of hindsight, because if I was to invert that, it sounds like at that point of time, it was a very, very big deal.
Yeah, it wasn't obvious.
Yeah.
It was an obvious plus. So that's one side of the story. The other side of the story is, of course, as you want to do something next, the way, like having some kind of signals that you have been successful matter, because that's how you can get something better next time. Right. Like you get a better job, or you can start something bigger. And when you make a decision like that, I mean, no one wants to hear that. Like when you're interviewing with people and you're like, well, it didn't work out. It's not the kind of story they want to hear. They want to hear a success story. They want to hear a story if you've done something great. At the same time, you don't want to really bullshit. You want to like find the right way to communicate it. I think that was harder. As I start slowly having conversations with people and people really questioning you, are you really any good? If that's what happened. But the majority of people outside you pursuing next opportunities completely don't care. Just move on.
And so zooming in is like you made a decision that it makes sense to wind down, and you got a consensus of your teammates, your supporters. And so I think that's where it kind of like bifurcates into two parts, which is I think the professional process of winding something down. Yeah. And then there's the personal process of, I don't know, grieving, coming to grips with it. So I'm just kind of curious like how you see those two tracks. Yeah.
Yeah. The professional one, I mean, the one with the winding down a business, I think it's a quicker one to explain. Yeah. It's really painful in Southeast Asia. You know, like Singapore is like an outlier, and in Singapore things are pretty straightforward and you can do things fast. But in Indonesia, like we had an entity there, we still do. It takes a while because you want to make sure that the way you close it, you do it the right way so that there is no tax exposure and there is a lot of gray areas. So you hire one vendor and they tell you one thing, and you hire another vendor and they tell you a contradicting thing, and then you keep on going through that until you figure out what's the right approach, and then you start doing it. Then it takes a few years because you need to maintain a state of dormancy. So that's really not fun. And at that point in time, everyone kind of lost interest and no one gets paid to do that. Yeah. So that's one side of running a company that no one talks about, but you have to do what you have to do. I still deal with this, and I think it's fine, and I think it's the least I can do for our investors and the rest of the co-founders.
How, just for a quick one, is just like, at least for an Indonesia startup, what's the expectation you think for a timeline? Like 1 year, 2 years, 3 years?
It depends on how you manage the foreign capital. So like if let's say, because most startups would have an entity in Singapore where they would collect their capital, depending on how the money are whether they're given as a loan or they're given in a different, like you might have a tax exposure. If you have a tax exposure, you got to maintain, and again, this is not professional advice.
Of course,
I don't mean to advise how, and who knows how things have evolved since we started. So maybe things are different by now. But it's advisable to have a state of dormancy to show that actually the company is not operating. Right. So that you can prove to the government that like we're not trying to do anything shady here. We actually are shutting down the business. Yeah. And the last thing you want is like a business that didn't work out to pay a lot of tax on. Because you're like, well, it's not like we're trying to hide anything here. We're just really like shutting down the business. Right. So because of that, that's a bit tricky, and you need to maintain a state of dormancy. Different people advise for different duration. But yeah, like I have met some smart founders that actually they knew this may happen and they managed things internally differently to prevent that long kind of effect that we needed to deal with. And I also met people that had no idea. They were like, oops, now I need to be more careful.
Yeah.
But yeah, like you need like 3 to 5 years, I guess.
3 to 5 years. Okay, I had the word 3 in my head, but 5 does feel like a long time. Yeah. Well, okay, so that's something for us to complain about the Indonesia and also to some extent some of the other Southeast Asia, like incorporation and other dynamics. But I think that makes it more painful, obviously, as a shutdown or wind down process for every founder and every VC who has to deal with that portfolio. So they put that on one side. But let's talk about the personal side, which is that you got to make a set of decisions, which is there's a grief side and then there's like a next chapter, get a job side. So how do you think about those?
Unfortunately, when you're a foreigner, when you're an expat, you don't have much time to grieve because you're on a visa. And the moment you don't have a sponsor, like off you go.
Yeah.
So, and I talk to many founders here who are foreigners like me, and they're in the same situation. They're like, once they decide to move on for whatever reason, they're like, I need to make a decision quick. And because you need to make a decision quick, it's very hard to make the right decision because you're just pressured. So you don't have the luxury of, okay, I'm going to take 3 to 6 months to think about what is the best job and talk to a lot of people. So in a way, that's good because that forces you to not think too much about what happened and to focus on what's next. So in that sense, you need to have this agency and urgency to figure it out. So you start talking to people, figuring out things and mapping what's possible, what's not possible. So my process was like, at Greenhouse, I was in charge of sales. And I think one learning here is that when you have an external role in your company, you have relationships. If you have an internal role, it's very hard to go tap on these relationships. And in Asia, I guess not just in Asia, but all over the world, but in Asia in particular, relationships matter a lot. At least they open the door to a conversation. So because of that, many of our big customers have been trying to recruit me for years before that. And I was always like, no, man, I can't do that. I can run a business. But now I'm like, what? Well, the time might have come now. Like, want to have that conversation? So that really accelerates things. So now I always think that whatever I do, I need to have some external exposure so that I build that network. So I always have like a plan B. And I was very fortunate that Docquity was our largest customer. I literally remember Docquity coming to Greenhouse when it was just the founder and starting in Indonesia. And I was like, okay, let me connect you with this guy and that guy. And I did my best to help. And because of that, because I helped in the early days, we always had really good relationships.
Yeah.
And when I told him, like, I'm looking for what's next for me, he's like, what? Write your JD. And no one else is going to apply for that job. And that job's going to wait for you and take as much time as you need. And if you want to sign now, you sign now. I want to give you some time, but I'll take care of you. And for me, that was like, wow, so like, that was the right kind of approach I needed at that time. Whereas I met some other founders where it's very important that early on you have this feeling of trust between the two parties. And because I felt there's so much sense of trust, and they let me write my own JD, which made me think, okay, what do I actually want to do? And at that time, I wrote my JD as Chief of Staff. And if you want, I can talk more about that as well.
Yeah, and we also had that meeting at that time. So Brave, we organized like an annual kind of like gathering for founders who are closing that chapter of their lives and moving to a new chapter. So we call it like the Phoenix program, just for people to chat for a few hours virtually. And I think part of that I always remember was like we had some of these conversations. I think there was one time when you were listening. Then after that, you came back as a panelist, sharing to other founders who are going through the piece. And I think a part that I kind of personally remember is, at least from the group, was like there's pain and there's some level of like getting out of the pain. And the biggest question that always came all the time was like, how do I accelerate this? How do I make this faster? Or how do I skip steps to get through from, I don't know, the pain to, I don't know, the new job and success, rebirth. I'm just kind of curious about your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think, again, I can speak about myself. Different people have different personalities and different things that drive them in life. In my case, it's very important that I contribute more than I consume. That, like, I have come to realize that as long as I contribute and it's appreciated, meaning it actually helps people, I'm at a good place. And it's very important quickly to find something that, at least in my case, it's worth working very hard for. The moment I find something, okay, this is an interesting vision or direction that this product or new company is taking, and I can play a very important role, and I start taking on more and more responsibility. For me, that really heals me very fast, because now my mind is completely focused on how do I get that job done at this time. So discovering that's a bit tricky, because as you grow older and you become a little bit more wise, hopefully, you narrow down the things that excite you, and you have good justification of why something is interesting and something is not, at least in your own life. But once you discover that and you just dive into it, it really helps, because now I'm solving this big problem and it matters, and I play an important role, and I feel appreciated. For me, that's like, it really accelerates healing that wound.
And I think part of that dynamic is like a lot of founders have to make decisions like, do I be a founder again?
Yeah.
Which was very common. I mean, I think remember in our groups,
Yeah.
versus obviously being a VC, there's another one.
Yes.
I think becoming an employee. So how do you think about that? How were you thinking about that?
Yeah, that's a very good one. I think obviously, like, if you enjoy the founder journey, no matter what happened, you would eventually want to be a founder again. I think at least that's what I see in myself and I see in other people. The question is, do you want to do it immediately? Like, you just suffered so much and you worked yourself to the bone for months, being underpaid in a high stressful environment. Do you want to go and start all over again, something similar that is very uncertain? Because the beginning of a startup is where it's like the hardest, I feel, because the lack of, like, there's so much uncertainty and we don't have product market fit, and are you working on the right problem and all that. So because of that, do you want to go through this immediately, or do you want to take some time to lick your wounds and then come back when you're like completely recovered, at a better mental place, also financially a little bit safer? And as you get older, you start having a wife and kids, and like, you got to be more careful how you make these decisions. So I see a lot of people jumping again to start a startup, but very often these people are a little bit younger, right, in their 20s, and like, they're like, what's the worst thing that can happen? And I think in your 20s it kind of makes sense, like, do whatever you want to do. But as you get older, you got to be a bit more careful. So at the time when I was making the decision, I was already dating seriously my current wife. So now I was like, okay, now I have someone I need to look after. Like, I can't be just making decisions that are selfish, one-sided decisions. Now I need to make decisions that benefit both of us. So that was one thing that played a lot of role. And second thing is, like, if I'm going to work for someone, do I respect that person? Can I learn from that person? And can I grow in that? Like, can I reach like similar level to what I had before with regards to learning and accomplishment, or in any capacity would I feel good? And if the answer is yes, like, you have room to grow and it's an interesting business and it grows fast, why not?
Yeah.
The VC route, I think a lot of founders think they can be great VCs. I think you're way better positioned than me to answer this because you've done it. But my thinking is that it's a lot harder than it looks. Like, yes, the job scope is kind of no-brainer. You really understand what's the job. But to be really effective, I think it takes certain traits that not everyone has.
Yeah.
Like, I have come to realize that I'm way too empathetic with founders to make some hard investment decisions that sometimes, like, I would maybe support too much a founder that I like over a founder that maybe I don't like that much, but is running a more successful business. And because of that, I don't think that I'm the best person to be an investor, because at the end of the day, as an investor, you need to make money. So because of that, I always felt like, I don't know if that's the right path for me. I think it would be interesting and I would learn a lot of things on the other side, but is it like, do I move directionally in the right direction, or is it a detour? So because of that, I kind of decided to follow the Docquity job, because again, they gave me the freedom to write my own. And I literally wrote the JD for entrepreneur in residence, which is like, I'm a founder inside the company. So because of that, I was like, high upside, like, I have resources, I can do a lot of things, I can do it at a much bigger scale. The company is much later. At that time, we were preparing for our Series C. So I was like, it would be very interesting for me to learn that, because I learned a lot about from 0 to 1, but how do I know from 1 to 100, right, what to do? Yeah. So that was kind of my process. I know it's not a very clear answer how to make that decision, but I don't think there is one formula that you can follow.
Yeah. I agree with you about the VC and founder role. I mean, it's kind of like soccer. It's like the soccer player and the team coach, they're playing the same sport. So a soccer player is like, I can be the coach. And maybe the coach is like, I can be a soccer player.
Yeah.
It's the same sport, the same rules, but your skill set is quite dramatically different, and your view and incentives are totally different as well.
Yeah.
So I agree with you about that, having gone through the transition from founder to VC and now back to a startup executive. So what's interesting, and I think you hinted at that, was kind of like the change in identity of a founder, which I think is a very painful loss, I guess. I mean, as a founder, you're calling the shots, people are listening to you, and then you become an employee. So I'm just kind of curious how you think about that.
Yeah, I think that's the first thing you learn, that you need to manage your ego. And you can't, like, when you're the founder, you have this incentive to move things fast. But now you join a new organization, and in that new organization, there is a certain dynamic. And there are certain things you don't know. There's a lot of context that you're missing. So sometimes if you push too hard in the wrong part of the organization, it may backfire. So you need some time to actually learn what makes sense, what doesn't make sense. And also to build your own reputation. And because I had a chief of staff role, first of all, no one knows what chief of staff is like. People like, everyone thinks that I handle HR. And I keep, every week I get someone on LinkedIn would reach out selling me some software for HR. So most people don't know. And that externally and internally. But as a chief of staff, essentially what you do, you're the right hand of the founder. And because you're the right hand of the founder is going to be like, you know what, go in this market and fix X. And you go there and people are like, who are you? Like, why are you here telling us what to do? And because of that, you have authority in a way, but people don't recognize it. So you gotta like lead without the authority. And that means people need to like you and trust you before they start listening to you. So it's a very tricky role in a way. That's what I learned. And this balance between you gotta really prove yourself because you work next to the founders have really high expectations of you to achieve things that for whatever reason they struggle to achieve. And that's why they need you for a long time. At the same time, internally, you face a lot of resistance from everyone. Everyone's like, I don't want to work with you. I don't want to listen to you. Like, who are you? Like, I never met you. And they would openly resist you at times. So that takes a while, and finding that balance between, okay, how to build my reputation inside the organization, how to manage my ego so that I know when I need to give up on things and when I have to push very high. That's a very tricky thing. And up until today, I don't think I have a very clear playbook of how to do it. And it's a lot based on intuition, but you learn that. You learn that over time. So that was very, very interesting in the beginning. I think now I'm at a good place where I am recognized across the organization. Like people understand my role better and they listen to me, but not because of my role, but because of the reputation that I built.
And I think we're kind of talking a little bit about that transition, which is the founder identity towards an employee to an executive or teammate. What other changes did you have to let go, I guess, from being a founder versus what were the skills that you needed to build?
You have a lot of new context that you need to learn in the new organization that is very different than the context that you used to have. Maybe the organization is bigger, maybe it's in a different industry. So there is a lot of knowledge that you might have that might not be applicable anymore. And there is a lot of things that you need to build from 0 to 1. Like you need to understand the industry. So for example, one thing I did, I really tried to find the smartest people in healthcare that I could and to get like a crash course on like the basics, the foundations. Really didn't have the foundations, and without a foundation, it's very hard to even have a conversation because people keep on throwing at you like all kinds of abbreviations and terminology. And even though the conversation might be relatively simple, but because of that, there is a barrier for you to understand what's going on, and you want to remove that barrier. So there is a lot of context that they built in one industry that suddenly was almost like it didn't bring almost any value. At the same time, there were a lot of things that at Greenhouse didn't work out, and they were massively successful. The very same process, the very same idea, the very same concept. And it really taught me something that sometimes it's not that you're necessarily failing, but you're failing the context. Like what you're trying to do at that particular time, with that particular team, in this company, maybe not the right thing, but the very same thing in another company will be very successful. So a lot of these like kind of lessons that some things I needed to like completely leave behind, and some things that at first glance didn't work out, now worked out very well in the new organization. So a lot of learnings in between all that, and how do you like kind of figure out what is valuable, what is not, and how do you adapt?
Yeah. And what's interesting is that during this process, you've also started writing as well, which is something I noticed. I mean, you've obviously never been a writer. And then after that, during this transition, I think you also started writing. Could you share a little bit more about why?
Yeah, I always felt like, so first of all, when you write things, I think the moment you try to write something, you realize how little you know about the topic. I think that's number one. Because in your mind, you're like, oh my God, like I understand this issue so well. And then you try to write it down and you're like, it's just so hard to explain it in a way that everyone would understand. And that's number one. Like writing helps you to clarify your thinking. Do you truly understand something or not? And very often I realize I don't understand a lot of things, or my understanding is not sufficient enough. So I need to, go deeper. So that was one. Another one was like, I always felt like because of my role and because of the life that I chose to have, like being a founder, traveling a lot, there is a lot of things I learned. And I feel good when I share that, whether people recognize it or not. Like, I think there is a lot of, I get a lot of value when I push something out. And even if it doesn't get a lot of traction, but I feel like I managed to phrase it the way I wanted, it feels great for me. Like I was like, okay, it's almost like you release some storage in your brain so that you can now focus on something else. Like you managed to like package it, you pushed it out, and now you have more space in your mind for something else. So like I kind of always had intuition that that's the case with writing. And then I started writing and I realized it's way harder than I thought. But that intuition kind of drove me there. So it's not like I had a conversation or something like that, but I always felt like sooner or later I need to write. And then as you start writing, even in the very beginning, you start noticing things like all kinds of serendipitous opportunities. Like, I mean, for example, maybe so many people in Singapore recognize me at events, even though I never met them. And whether they think of me as someone who is great or not, they recognize me and they come and they want to have a conversation. That opens a lot of serendipitous opportunities. So also experiencing that early on and getting a lot of value out of this, I felt like I should just continue.
I'm kind of curious, like, what do you like writing about versus what do you notice people want you or the algorithm likes you to write about? I'm just kind of curious to just the difference.
Yeah, I think the things I like to write about are like hard-earned lessons. Let's say that you manage people for 10 years and you have a performance review with someone. At the end of this performance review, you have this insight. Something clicks, but not only because of that performance review or that conversation, but because now there is a lot of dots that connected in your entire career. And it's almost like a puzzle got built. And you're like, boom, there is an insight there. And these kind of hard-earned insights that come through your experience, I love writing about. And I'm always of the opinion, if it's interesting to me, someone else would find it interesting as well. So I want to throw that. But then what people like very often is very different. Like very early, because as a founder, you're always thinking like, how do you find product market fit? And the same thing with your content market fit or whatever you call it. And very early on, you start making experiments and you start noticing what works and what doesn't work. And the things that work and people like are very shallow and things that I don't enjoy writing. And at some point you kind of crack the algorithm and you're like, if I continue writing this kind of content, I would likely do well. But do I want to write this kind of content? No. I would rather have fewer people that follow me, but they resonate with me better, rather than I appeal to many people, but my brand is very weird. Like the personality that I'm building online is not who am I, right? So you realize that what you want versus what the algorithm wants is very different. Like, especially on LinkedIn, which LinkedIn is the biggest platform in this part of the world. A lot of like, I don't know, like cringe things that like people will try, and you see that they're written for the sake of getting engagement and they work, but I'm like, I just don't want. So I experimented with that and I stopped. And right now I'm in a place where I would rather I think of it as a bad signal, like you send a bad signal in the sky. And there's very few people that see it, and that's okay. But the people that see it and that want to respond to it are the right kind of people. And these are the kind of people I want to build my relationship, because I know that I'm very like-minded with them.
Very interesting. I'm kind of curious, what do you think the algorithm wants from you, from what you've noticed?
Yeah, I think the algorithm wants things that are more, the vast majority of people would relate to. Like you want something that is very like, if you're too technical in your explanation, if I use language that only founders would use, or only specific founders that have raised money, which is again, now you narrow the population very much, right, to 0.1% of population. Right. Now, these guys would get it, but the majority of people wouldn't get it. No. So the way these platforms are often designed is that they want things that everyone gets, and they're simple enough. But the problem with that is that you kind of do a bit of what everyone else does. And do you want more of that? Like, for example, things like what the general population would agree on is how employers are evil and how they want to pay you less. And like when you write something like that, I can guarantee you, like it immediately gets a lot of traction, because there's a lot of people that have had a bad experience in their life once or twice or maybe consistently, and they relate to it and they jump on it. But that's not what I want to write about, because maybe there is a component of truth to it. I'm not saying it's not, but that's not the kind of persona I want to build.
Right. Gotcha. So that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. And I think I'm just kind of curious, because having been a founder, going through the wind down process, you've also seen that as an executive, and now also as a writer about Southeast Asia tech. I'm just kind of curious, like we see like quite a bit of fraud in the Southeast Asia ecosystem, at least allegations. So we won't mention all the names. You and I probably kind of like know all the names, very public.
Yeah.
And then, for example, there's E535, there's allegations, there's investigation. So let's see what comes out. But I think it's interesting because when it came out, I was like, not surprised in a way. I mean, not surprised, not necessarily in the E535 case, but not surprised that there is a culture of fraud in Southeast Asia. I mean, I think you've probably heard the jokes. It's like X country has 3 sets of books, Y country has 5 sets of books, because of their, I don't know, history with government versus tax, what they want to manage. So I don't know, how do you think that happens? Because I think for me, my reflection is like, I mean, nobody starts the fraud slide because they're like, I want to get caught in 5 years and have people write about this, right? So my theory is like, people are like just scared. Like you do it from an act of, I don't know what's the word, desperation, or like you don't want to fail. I don't know, how do you think about it?
In Western storytelling, you look at movies, there is always like the good guy and the bad guy and the bad guy. And no one questions why he's a bad guy or how he turned to be a bad guy. And I also watch some anime. In Japanese storytelling, what you see is, there is a bad guy, but how the bad guy turned to be a bad guy. So they go really deep to kind of explain at what point, what happened and how it turned. And I think there is a lot of truth to it, that no one is purely evil and wants to game the system. And I don't think this is only specific to Southeast Asia. I think it's human nature. It happens in many countries. Maybe less in countries like Singapore, Denmark, Switzerland, but in many countries it does happen. In the US, we see all the time. It happens. And I think the challenge that we see is that as a founder, like the people who are, in my experience, good founders are very intense, very competitive. And to build a company from 0 to 1, you need to be very creative in the way you solve problems. Like you can't just go by the same route everyone else takes, because if you do that, the probability of success is low, and there's many other companies that are trying to do the same thing. So you need to kind of navigate the system. And I think some rules are okay to be bent a little bit here and there because they don't make sense. But there's some rules that you absolutely should steer away from, like accounting practices and stuff like that. So I think that intensity and competitiveness that are core traits in good founders, if they're not paired with high degree of integrity, can go very easily. It's a slippery slope. It can go in the wrong direction. And I saw it with myself, not that I have committed anything bad, but when I saw a little bit of success in my life early on, I thought that I'm the shit and I know it all. And a few of my friends would come and say, you're turning into a bad person. I don't want to hang out with you. You're not the kind of person I want to have around. And it really made me think. And I'm like, do I really know it that? Do I really know that much? Do I know it all? And it's a very humbling experience. And I tried to become a way more balanced person. And now I think twice. Like sometimes I get these, I don't know, like opportunities that look too good to be true, and or that look a bit dodgy. And I'm like, I just want to steer away from it. I don't want. Like there is this thing called, I think Nassim Taleb calls it the risk of ruin. Like, and certain things you should absolutely stay away from, like killing people and stealing things and gambling. It's just hard no. But unfortunately, because I think the nature of many founders is such that they have this intensity, if they're not balanced with a healthy degree of integrity, here and there they may take a wrong turn.
Yeah, and I think that's the wrong turn. And then I think it compounds. You're like, once you're in it, slippery slope, you just got to keep doing it. How do you explain yourself? So I think it's a tricky position for a lot of folks that are in that space. I think kind of like double clicking here as well is like, now that you've kind of like zoomed out from all of that, is there any advice that will give, like, I don't know, at that meeting that, let's just say you're doing a video call by the time when you were like the only person effectively, and then you're still pushing hard and everything. And let's just say instead of the video call where I called you and we had a conversation, imagine if it's yourself traveling back in time to video call yourself at that point of time, several years ago. What advice would you give yourself?
I think at that time, I thought that it's very important to engineer my career path in a very particular way. And if I don't, like, I need to be a founder, or maybe I need to be a VC. Like, I need to be something that makes sense. And what I have realized is that there's so many ways to reach what you want. I would likely tell myself, don't be too judgmental towards the opportunities that come your way. Sometimes some companies don't look great on the outside, but then you meet the founders, see what's going on, and you realize it's very interesting. In the process of interviewing at that time, I interviewed with many companies. And one of my realizations is no matter how big a company was, like I talked to some billion-dollar companies from the US, they were a complete mess on the inside. And I realized that how you present yourself is not necessarily a reflection of how are you internally. So I should be more open-minded towards opportunities coming my way. I should focus on the fundamentals rather than on looks and the brand of that business, how sexy it is, and how it aligns with my view of what is a great career. So be open-minded. Try to explore things that are not obviously great. In fact, the things that are not obviously great might be very interesting because fewer people compete for them.
And I think that's actually a big part, because I'm reading the subtext here, but the reason why people want to go for VC or a certain brand is because you have a, I don't know, inadequacy. And so you want to be like, oh, I failed, therefore I need something that is successful to cover that. And I say that obviously from my own personal experience as well. So I'm just kind of curious about how you think about that.
No, 100%. It's, I think everyone wants some degree of status.
Yeah.
And there is a certain degree of insecurity that I guess we all have. And one thing I have come to realize is offends me or makes me feel uneasy. Likely there is an insecurity inside me rather than there is a problem with that thing. Whether it's a person, a business, a decision, whatever is going on in the world, if I feel uneasy, in the past, I would kind of completely focus on that thing and be like, well, that's wrong, whatever. And now I'm like, okay, if I feel uneasy about this whole thing, maybe I have an insecurity. Like if that job doesn't look great, or if that decision doesn't look like, what is the insecurity that holds me from making the right decision? That is objectively good for me, right? And I have realized I have a lot of this, like everyone else. Like, I think it's human nature.
Yeah.
So you try to overcompensate by aiming for this really sexy, because it does help, to be honest. It does help. I see people who, if you get the right career trajectory with the right brands, it does make your life easier. It is what it is. And otherwise you play life at harder mode. But I think it can still be very fulfilling.
I think I like what you said earlier, which is that it is a harder mode. And I think what you also said is like you can take your time. And I think if you're trying to do everything all at once, it's impossible, or I think you get tempted to do wrong things in that sense. But I think if you relax the time scale, then some amazing things happen. You get a good job, you get married, all these things can happen within that, I don't know, relaxation.
Correct. Again, like just certain things are kind of obviously great and certain things are not obviously great. But even though they're not obviously great, there still can be a lot of interesting things that can happen inside. Like when I talked to Docquity in the beginning, I was like, I don't know, like most of my friends don't know about Docquity. No one really heard about it. Does it make sense? Does it not make sense? But I knew the founders.
Yeah.
Like, so I know one thing for sure. The people running the business are high integrity people that I can trust. And they have done a wonderful job from 0 to 1. And they have done it without building any publicity whatsoever.
Right.
Maybe something is great here. Right?
Yeah.
Maybe there is a room for me to come in and do some good things inside. So that's kind of the lesson I learned. Again, over-fixating with what we talked about earlier. As a founder, your business is like, I think I cannot find a source right now, but someone said that when you run a company and when you have children, it's very similar areas of the brain that get triggered. Because you think of your company like your kid. It's such a big thing. But the difference is that when your company disappears, no one really cares. And it's the same thing when you make a decision to work somewhere or to do whatever it's next. No one cares. It's for you. The rest of the people they can't be bothered.
Yeah. And I guess the last question I want to ask you is, could you share about a time that you personally have been brave?
I think maybe 2 times. One time when I moved to Denmark when I was 18. No one in my family ever studied at university. No one had ever traveled abroad at that time, and we didn't have the financial resources. I think everyone told me that I'm stupid for doing it and that I'm going to return very soon, and including my family. They were very, very scared about myself. But I always had this strong intuition that I have to do it and it's going to push me in a good direction. So I did it. And the second time when I moved to Asia, because again, the moment my life in Denmark stabilized after 7 years, I had friends, I had finally I could get a good job, I was well educated, and Denmark is a wonderful place if you want to have a balanced life. But I could sense that this is not the life I want, and I moved to Asia. And then again, when you do that, you start from zero once again. So I think these 2 moments I feel like are a time when I don't know if I would do it today, no? I think back then made sense, but today I don't know.
You wouldn't do it now. I was brave back then, but I wouldn't move right now.
And maybe I tell myself a lot of excuses about now you have a wife, you need to also look after your parents and stuff like that. But are these excuses, or I don't know?
Oh, you are happier because you have a wife and you have family figured out, the job, so everything works.
True, but sometimes you also want to, I don't know, even later in life make these decisions. I think I hate seeing some people later in life who clearly regret not making these decisions, and I'm really scared to become like that. I don't think I will, but it is kind of a fear I have, because just because you get comfortable and because you have things to look after doesn't mean you should not also pursue the best version of yourself. And the best version of yourself means that you need to relocate, start a new company, or whatever, or get a job. Whatever it is, why not do it? Hopefully we can always reinvent ourselves, no matter the age and the responsibilities we have.
Yeah, amazing. On that note, I'd love to summarize the 3 big takeaways I got from this conversation. First of all, thanks so much for sharing your experience of making a decision about whether to persevere, pivot, or wind down that company in Indonesia. And I think you shared very clearly the professional aspects, for example, taking 3 to 5 years to wind down an entity in the emerging markets, versus the professional side, which is about dealing with the shadow of grief, but also having to think through the dynamics of financials, visa, and going through that psychological piece. Secondly, thanks so much for sharing about the founder journey from transitioning from a founder identity to an employee identity or VC identity, but very much a transition about the inside-out perspective about what it takes to grieve, but also to learn new skills, but also let go of other skills that you previously had. And I really like what you said, which is do you need to be a founder now? Or can you be a founder again years down the road? So I think that's a really fascinating piece. And lastly, thanks so much for sharing your perspective on Southeast Asia startups. Obviously, we talked a little bit about some of the incentives towards fraud. I think that can happen from a founder perspective. Also talking a little bit about why you decided to move to Asia, what makes a good company from your perspective, what are the markers of strong founders, and how you've landed up in a strong chief of staff role at a strong startup that people may not necessarily kind of see as a high status compared to other roles like VC or whatever it is. But I thought it was just fascinating to hear, I think, all those aspects about it. On that note, thank you so much, Victor, for sharing your journey.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to Brave. If you enjoyed this episode, please share the podcast with your friends and colleagues. We would also appreciate you leaving a rating or review. Head over to www.bravesea.com for member content, resources, and community. Stay well and stay brave.